Welcome to Novel Ideas, where we chat with local authors. I'm here with my co-host, Josh Brogadir.
It's great to be with you, Carol. And tonight we have the pleasure of joining Ray Daniel, who is a writer of many things from what we're now understanding.
Yeah.
But certainly crime fiction under the name Ray Daniel. Great to have you with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's
Absolutely.
fantastic.
Just want to launch right in for a moment. You're somebody who has done a lot of different writing, but crime fiction specifically, and now, as we've talked about, or we're going to talk about, the Tucker mysteries. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved in writing, Ray.
You know, it's funny. I should have known that I wanted to be a writer. I didn't start till I was 40-something, but I have an engineering degree with an English minor, so that should have been a clue. When I got out of college, the first book I bought was a writing book, Zisner on Writing Well.
Sure.
That should have been a clue. I once wrote a report for business school as a short story, maybe a clue. No clue. I was playing chess, and then one day in my 40s, I read a book called Now Discover Your Strengths. And the book's basic premise was, you should do what you're good at. And I'm like, I'm terrible at chess. My rating has not improved in 20 years, but I'm a decent writer. I should do that. So I literally quit the chess club and joined a writing group and sort of switched my focus over to writing. And that went real well. As we were talking about, originally, way back, I wrote a nonfiction business book. Immediately got published and was out there, and I'm like, oh, this is easy, right? And then decided that I wanted to sort of follow my original dream, which was to write first-person wisecracking Boston-based mysteries. Because people would say, what do you like to read? And I'd say, I like to read first-person wisecracking Boston-based mysteries. Mostly Robert Parker, but also Linda Barnes. Right? There were a lot of those. So I wanted to write that, and I started down that path, and it turns out fiction writing is a lot harder to break into than nonfiction writing. And that took about 9 years, and then I started getting published in fiction.
But you actually worked in the business world and the computer world for a number of years.
Still do.
Oh.
Yeah, still do. There's actually very few writers who make a living at writing, like all the arts. There's a few people who make a ton of money, and then there's a lot of people who make no money that they can live on doing their art, but they enjoy it. And there's nothing in the middle. Another writer named Lee Child told a story about how when he lost his job, he decided he would be a writer for a living. And he told his agent, you know, I want to have like a upper middle income. And the agent's like, oh, that's not possible. You can either be rich or you can be poor. He's like, well, let's do rich. So he did rich.
Nice.
But most people who you read make their money either teaching writing or some other way to do it. Yeah.
Is that just the nature of the way the business works in terms of number of books sold and the reputation of that author growing or not growing, or why would that be? Yeah,
there's it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once an author can break through and their name is known, then, because you think about it, people buy a book, you're going to invest 6-8 hours in a book, but you don't know whether it's going to be any good or not. And if you're getting on a plane, you're going to be trapped on the plane with that book for the whole time. And so if you have a brand name you can pick and say, oh, I know I like Robert B. Parker, I'll take one of those, then you know what you're going to get. And that sort of starts to fulfill itself. And so you have a group of authors whose names are the primary reason that they sell. They're good writers, but people know them, so they just buy those books. And then there's people trying to break into that space. And it's very hard to be in the middle, somewhere between those two.
Right.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because I think your writing reflects an awful lot of your other career or your other world. Even the title of Corrupted Memory, one of your earlier books.
Yep.
Elaborate a little bit more as to how you feel like these two interplay with each other? Or?
Well, you know, in my case, I am an engineer. I came from I'm in an industry that's had a lot of crime, actually. The electronic design automation business, though sleepy and unknown, has literally had a CEO who was in prison trying to hire a guy to kill the judge, has had software stolen If you saw the movie or read the book, The Big Short, the character in those stories, the guy who was somewhat on the spectrum, he made big money early on buying shares in this company that stole another company's software, and had, because they were all arrested and whatnot, the stock had hit rock bottom, and he figured, well, it can't go any lower, and he bought in then. Right. And looking at that, I'm like, well, there could be a lot of crime in tech. That would be fun. And so that's how Tucker was born, as an engineer, and he was originally actually in my actual field, but the feedback from the agents early on was like, character in the people don't want to read about a really obscure part of the technical world. So that's how he shifted into being a security software consultant, because everyone understands hacking, or at least viscerally understands hacking and has heard of it.
Yeah, that's something that I could actually relate to while I was reading that. I was thinking, this is a character who knows a whole lot more than I do about something that really affects the general public. I mean, people get hacked and they don't know why or how or what they did wrong. But even in this book, and we'll get much more into it in a little while, there are clues that people could pick up on, password protection, very basically, or not leaving yourself logged in at a public terminal in the Apple Store, or whatever it is, that I think can make this, and that makes it not a tech book per se, but somebody who has a tech character. So.
Exactly, and that was an intention, was people do like to read about a world that they're not part of. The Hunt for Red October was sort of the classic example of a big book that everyone learned about nuclear submarines, and we're happy to learn it. That's something people want to get out of their books, but they don't want to be bored, and they don't want to be lectured to. Right. And so you have to sort of weave it in there so that they can sort of see that new world, but also enjoy the story.
A lot of times authors are influenced by what they read early on. Were you always into mysteries as a kid, or?
As a kid, I read Isaac Asimov. In fact, in the 7th and 8th grade, I read Isaac Asimov exclusively, because the guy had written already 180 books. I mean, you could literally be exclusively reading Isaac Asimov for 2 years and not get through all of his stuff. And it might be that's where I sort of picked up sort of the patter, the short sentences and the dialogue and the boop kind of thing. And then my cousin turned me on to Robert B. Parker, and then that I just loved. I loved not only the way it was written, but I also am really into location, and I loved that idea of, like, I know that spot, I know where that happened.
Yes. Right. Yeah, the location so comes through. I mean, in this book that we're going to be talking about later, I was so shocked. I actually read the book when it first came out. And then when we were going to have the show, I decided I better go back in, and I sort of knew what was going to happen. So I kept thinking, wait a minute, Commercial Street goes here and Battery Street. This sounds really accurate. I pulled out a map, and oh my gosh, it was, dead on. Yeah. You couldn't get any closer. Did you actually live there?
My grandmother lived there. So
in the North End? In
the North End, in an apartment that's in this book. So the whole setup of one of the apartments where stuff happens is my grandmother's apartment, just tucked in there. So I had a pretty clear, what was hard about that is you sort of live in an area, you don't quite realize some of the strangeness about it. When I grew up, you walked down a long court, you got to my grandmother's house at the end of a long court. You don't realize the reason that's the case is they had a triangular block, and they built houses all around the triangle, and then they just stuck one right in the middle. And the one in the middle was my grandmother's house. That was the one. But yeah, so I had a real strong feeling for that. And actually, the cover of this book has the Paul Revere statue. Yep. The reason for that is my family's tradition is that everybody took pictures in front of that statue. So I've got pictures of my mother in front of that statue, my kids in front of that statue, and me in front of the statue. Yep. So it was kind of nice to sort of pull my own personal family part into it.
Well, there's no question that this is a book for people who love to learn things about Boston, or who can relate to Boston. And it's not just the North End. Obviously, you take us through the South End and other parts of the city as well. One of my favorite things about this book, and I'm sure it's the case in all your Tucker books, I haven't read the other ones yet, is that you're able to, you can follow what's happening. Very walkable, or sometimes you're in a car. There's one scene where we're in traffic, and you know it's supposed to take just a couple of minutes to get there, but really it's an hour.
Yeah.
And I think that anyone who loves Boston will be very interested in following that path.
Yeah, it's a challenge to write that, because I've heard some people complain that some books read like a GPS.
Right.
And so, and you got to think, if the average reader who's not from Boston isn't going to really know the streets, they're going to kind of make their own little map in their head. But the person who is from Boston is going to know the streets. So you have to sort of pick and choose the details that the knowing person is like, oh, I know exactly where that is. And the other person just sort of fills it in and moves on. So you want, it's a sort of a little balancing act to get it right.
Yeah, how did you end up with this sequence of Tucker stories and your agent, and how does all this play in?
I mean, how did the sort of the Tucker franchise get started?
Yeah.
So I originally wrote Terminated, which is the first Tucker book, and that's the one where Tucker is trying to figure out who murdered his wife. Tucker and his wife were working on a project together, in a software project, and one day his boss calls him in and fires him, and he goes home and he finds his wife dead and murdered in the kitchen. And then it's 6 months later, and these clues have come out to like why this might have happened, and he's going to find out why it happened. So that I really like that book. It has a lot about marriage in it. One of the things that happens in the book early on is Tucker's wife actually keeps reappearing to him, and they just fight constantly. and it's part of that thing. Once you're married long enough, you don't need the other person to have the fights. You can just do it on your own.
Yeah, right.
And so I wrote that book. I really loved it. I wrote it 3 times as I learned how to be a writer. There's a 2 paths. Some people write the same book 3 times. Some people write 3 different books. I sort of went the 3 different times route. And then I put it down. I said, that book is as good as it's going to get. And I started writing Corrupted Memory, the second book, which was inspired by a funeral I was at. And someone told me a story about this guy who had a whole nother family that he'd kept secret from his first family. And I'm like, wow, what if that happened to Tucker? What would be the worst possible way to learn that?
Yeah.
So in Corrupted Memory, Tucker didn't know he had a brother until the guy was found murdered in front of his house. And so that's the second Tucker book. And we went to market with that book. That was the book my agent thought, this is great. And we went to market with it. It went to Midnight Ink, and the acquiring editor read the second book and said, wow, this is really good. But it reads like a second book. Is there a first book? Like, why, yes, there's this book.
Yes, there is.
And the whole process took so long that by the time I got the 3-book deal, I had also written this book. So I had written 3 books and got a 3-book deal, and they were written. So so I've never really been under deadline pressure because I'm able to stay ahead of the thing.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, that's terrific. Well, we're going to learn more about specifically Child Not Found as soon as we come back. Stay with us. We'll be right back here on Novel Ideas. And welcome back to Novel Ideas. We're here with author Ray Daniel, and we're going to talk about his 3rd book of the Tucker trilogy, Child Not Found. Ray, I have to say, and I just finished reading this book very recently, one of the things that was so telling, you mentioned that quick dialogue, the back and forth between characters. Once in a while, it's amazing that they can finish each other's lines, and it really creates pace in this book. 375 pages went very quickly.
Oh, good. That was the goal.
Yeah.
I always want someone to be able to buy the book in Boston, get on a plane, just read it and land in California and be done. You know, that's and if they were entertained the whole time, perfect.
I think that's the case. Tell us about Child Not Found.
So in Child Not Found, Tucker takes his cousin's daughter sledding on Boston Common and loses her. And then the rest of the book is him trying to find her, while everybody else seems to be not as interested. The police are more interested in his cousin's wife being murdered, and maybe his cousin did it. His cousin is interested in the gang war, because his cousin's in the mafia, about people who want to take over his position. And no one seems that interested in finding Maria, the girl. And so Tucker, that's just sort of his singular focus.
But I think a lot of this in the book, to me, Tucker was really driven by the guilt that he was the one that gave her the sled. And you know, she was gone at the bottom of the hill before he could do anything. And the whole book is about his guilt in a way.
Yeah, you know, and even, you know, I've had situations in my life where we lost a cat once. And she was gone she came back actually, but she was gone for a while. And you just have this feeling of just this unresolved gnawing at you about, well, whatever happened to her? How did I leave the door open? And then this sort of like replaying the thing to say, if I'd done this, it wouldn't have happened. If I had done that, it wouldn't have happened. And that was sort of, when I wanted to touch back to Tucker's feelings during the book, it was sort of that cat experience, that sort of like, what could I have done? And that's what I think keeps him moving forward.
Yeah.
One of the things about Tucker that I think draws me, Aloysius Tucker, by true name, is that he doesn't really seem to fit in with his family. You know, you have this family, it's a North End family, Italian family, and the mafia is present in their lives, but in some ways he doesn't think it's anything to do with his life. He thinks he can separate it. How did you write that kind of a character, or is that Tucker in all of your Tucker books? Is he sort of different from everyone else?
Tucker is that sort of represents that case of the person whose family is of the old world and they're of the new world, and this sort of split happens a lot in stories and happens a lot in people's life, and so that's what I wanted to capture with Tucker, was that sort of like, no, I live in America, right, and half of his family still thinks in terms of Italy. Even if they're not Italian, the culture just gets passed down. And Tucker's dad is not Italian, and that's the other half of it, is that he was English. So Tucker kind of veered in that direction as well.
Yeah, I love the characters and the wide variety of characters that you pull into the book. But my absolute two favorites are the pets.
Oh, yeah.
Click and Clack, and they seem to really play into the mood. I mean, at one point, you're sort of feeling like, you know, well, Tucker ought to be hungry, he hasn't eaten in a long time, and all of a sudden he's in there feeding Click and Clack.
Yeah.
Tell people who Click and Clack are?
So Click and Clack are Tucker's hermit crabs. You meet them right at the beginning of the first book. They're in page 1 of the first book. And, you know, they're actually the result of early feedback on Tucker. When I was writing the first book, Terminated, there was just the feedback I got was people wanted him to be a little more humanized, and I was kind of learning how to do that. And I was talking to this woman at this event where this feedback had come in, and she's like, well, you could give him a pet. And I'm like, I could give him a pet. And then the Click and Clack idea just sort of came at that moment. And it's very Boston,
Right.
Yes.
but it also ties into hermit crabs. And hermit crabs, for a fictional character, are great pets, because you don't have to walk them and you don't have to go home for them, right? But you can talk to them. And when scenes where Tucker's alone in his apartment, Click and Clack can provide that sort of dialogue without someone being there. So they
Cat talk.
Yeah, exactly.
Very nice. Would you read a passage for us,
sure.
please? Thanks.
So this is from somewhere in the middle of the book, and I'm just going to. The idea of this passage is it gets into how the Boston flavor of the book. That someone who's from Boston but even someone who's not from Boston will know what this part is about. So, a little tree stands in front of the 617 restaurant. A larger tree had stood in that spot until Zokhar Tsarnaev planted a bomb next to it and blew a hole in the Boston Marathon. The little tree got a lot of attention soon after it was planted. People festooned it with flowers, ribbons, and Boston Marathon runners' numbers. Time passed and the shrine was cleared. The Red Sox won the World Series, and people largely forgot how the little tree got its start. Today, the tree stood leafless, covered in snow, waiting for April when its leaves would bud and new people would stand next to it, watching their friends and neighbors run the final block to the finish line. I tapped the tree's bark for luck and entered the restaurant. So, you know, if you're from Boston, you kind of know that tree and you know that spot.
And you know the Tsarnaev story, and of course you know the
Yeah.
whole marathon story.
Yeah.
Yeah. No question about that.
And I wrote that because when they won the World Series, I was at the duck boat parade, and I intentionally stood there at the tree So I had so that notion of being festooned and whatnot sort of came from that initial, what I gathered in from being there that day.
Mm. Well, it also ends up playing in with one of the characters as well, which was pretty neat.
Yes, that's right. Tucker is going to have lunch with a female character named Caroline, who had lost part of her leg in the marathon bombing. And so she always goes and eats at the restaurant, which is actually the Forum restaurant, but the Forum restaurant has been closed and renamed, and so I just made up a name,
Right.
which I thought would, because you can only keep up so much with the names, then you just make your own.
I do notice a lot of this book, though, is very current, and a lot of the things that you say and you take us along, it's very modern. In fact, even his Twitter posts, which he does throughout the book, he's using hashtags and kind of almost like his little diary of as he goes. Clearly, a conscious choice to do something current. Yes,
there's some people feel that with all our modern technology, it's hard to write a mystery. That wouldn't he just whip out his cell phone and call the police? And in reality, it's really not. It doesn't affect it. The modern technology we live with fits in fine with a mystery, and the notion of calling the police actually existed a lot before there were cell phones. I mean, if you have a story and there's gunshots, your main character running towards the gunshot is not actually what really happens. We actually run away.
Right.
But then it's a boring story. So so it all kind of fits together and works well. And I really like being current. I accept the idea that one day the books will be dated. Tucker in Terminated has a BlackBerry.
I know someone who still has one.
There you go.
He refuses to let go of
There
it.
you go.
Yes, for the most part, right.
So you just got to kind of accept that and say, yeah, well, people will know when it was written.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. I don't know how we're doing on time.
Well, I think we're almost almost out of time.
I want to make sure that we mention your website is raydanielmystery.com.
Yep.
And there's a lot of neat stuff on there. There's also a really good little thing for authors about a procedural thing that's very nice.
Yes, sort of a story structure. My books are very cinematic. I write them so that they feel like movies, because that's how we consume stories today. And I have and I teach a class on creating the cinematic novel, so the material I use for that is up there, and if you download it, you can kind of see how it fits together.
Nice. Before we go, tell us what's next for Ray Daniel.
So on June 8th, Hacked comes out. Hacked is the 4th Tucker book. There's a serial killer murdering hackers, and the internet thinks Tucker's doing it. #Tuckergate. And it's going to be launched at the Barnes & Noble here in Framingham on June 8th at 7 o'clock.
Excellent.
Yep.
That's awesome. Yes. Well, I think that about wraps it up for this evening. Thank you so much for being with us, Ray. And thanks, Josh.
Of course.
Always enjoy working with you. Thank you for all the folks here at Access Framingham. And also our viewers. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, and hope to see you next time.
All right. Good night.